Hello, my name is David Bonior, and I'm just really pleased that I could join you with Jim McDermott and Father Peter Daly and talk about Ukraine and the war and what's happening and why we went there and what we saw and what we learned. So let me just first begin by saying that I grew up in a community inside Detroit called Hamtramck, Michigan, and my father was Polish and came from ancestors from Lublin and Krakow. And then my grandfather was Ukrainian, which came from Western Ukraine in 1912. He migrated to Canada and then in the United States, and eventually into Detroit, where he worked for many years in an auto factory in the city of Detroit. And I grew up with my Ukrainian grandfather. He didn't speak very good English, hardly any at all, actually, but he could understand it. And his community at the Immaculate Conception Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was a part of our community. And also I grew up Roman Catholic, so we had a Roman Catholic connection as well. The reason I tell you this is because the Ukrainians and the Poles had a history of not necessarily getting along very well in the last century. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about that in a little while. After school, after college, I ended up going into the Air Force. And then when I got out of the Air Force, I ran for the legislature in Michigan and got elected. And then 4 years later, I got elected to the US Congress, where I served for 26 years. And 11 of those were as whip of the Democratic Party in the US House of Representatives. So I was in the leadership and spent a lot of time working on leadership issues. So that's my little background, and I'm a writer now. I've been out of Congress now for 20 years, and because of my background as a Ukrainian American, I pay attention to what happens in that part of the world, particularly in Ukraine. And as most of probably you out there were terribly disturbed by what happened with the invasion. I was as well. And I wanted to do something. I just didn't want to write checks to humanitarian organizations, although that is critically important, and I encourage people to continue to do that if they are doing it. But I want to get it involved in some way. Jim and I particularly had a whole career based upon getting involved in war-torn zones and areas around the world. So we had something to offer. Plus, we knew that Ukraine's success depended upon the ability of it to continue to have a full pipeline of support and aid, humanitarian aid and military aid. And so I thought, well, let's try to do something more than just write the check. Let's go see what's going on. And so we got together. Father Daly is a good friend, and Jim's a good friend, and so we talked, and we decided we would make this trip on our own, on our own dime, and just to see just exactly what was there and what we could do. And so we did this in March, about 2 months ago, March 8th through the 22nd, a week in Poland and a week in Ukraine. And what was the idea of going? The idea was to get the stories of these refugees, these courageous people, and what their life was like, because we're talking about millions of people who had to leave the war zone. It was mostly women, children, and elderly people, and get their stories. And also the stories of the caregivers, especially in Poland, where they were just absolutely wonderful and generous and very special in what they provided to their neighbors to the south. So anyway, we decided to do that and write about it. And so that's where we are right now. We are in the process of writing, broadcasting, speaking on TV, through the internet, radio, you name it. We're all writers. We've all written books. and we all are doing articles now as well. So that's kind of our story, and we wanted to share some of that with you today. And New York University, and we want to thank Polly for helping out today, and especially Tom McIntyre, and of course Lynn Brown, who is the head of the Bradema Center. This is in cooperation with the Bradema Center at NYU, and those of us who are interested in this issue, and thank you for being interested as well. So that's what we're about. For those of you who don't know anything about Poland or Ukraine, Poland is about the size of New Mexico, Ukraine about the size of Texas. Not like the United States, but good size areas. And we started off in Poland. And if you know what Poland looks like, Warsaw is in the center of the country and a little bit to the east, more towards Belarus, but centrally, relatively centrally located. In Ukraine, from Warsaw, we took a train actually down. We were there for 3 days. We took a train down to Krakow in the southern part of Poland, spent 3 days there, and then over to Rzeszow, which was a base area in which about a town of 250,000. It's where Biden came when he landed his plane and then took a train into Kyiv. It's also where a lot of the NATO forces were assembled to aid and assist with all these millions of migrants who were coming in from Ukraine. And then after a week of that, we ended up going to Lviv, which is sort of the western capital of Ukraine. It's a beautiful city. And we ended up talking to students. We ended up talking to business people. We ended up talking to soldiers. We ended up talking to a host of refugees and those who were providing the aid to refugees during that week that we were in Ukraine. So that's our story on how this all happened and why we went and what we're doing right now. We've done a number of TV programs. We've done podcasts. We've written articles for newspapers and around the country. And so we're here talking to you today. So having said all of that, I'm going to stop and introduce to you Father Peter Daly, and then also I'm going to introduce at the same time Congressman and Dr. Jim McDermott, but we'll do them seriatim, and then Peter will go first, and then he'll follow by Jim, and then I'll make a few comments later, and then we'll open up the questions and comments that you might have. So let me just tell you about Peter. Peter is a retired Roman Catholic priest, sort of retired. I don't know if he'll ever be retired, but in the Archdiocese of Washington. He's also a lawyer, and he has a member of the bar in Washington, D.C. and in the Maryland bar. And he continues his activity in part-time parish work throughout the Washington, D.C. Archdiocese, and also includes various charities. He's a volunteer for the Catholic Charities and Immigration Legal Services. He is a board member and a retreat master of New Ways Ministry, the Catholic outreach to the LGBTQ plus community. And he's also done some really great work with his Association of Catholic Priests, the Brothers of Charity, which provides housing to formerly homeless men in Washington, D.C. And he's a contributing writer to the National Catholic Reporter, on whose board that I actually serve on. And he's done really some outstanding work in reporting and writing there. He's the author of a wonderful novel called Strange Gods, and I recommend it to you. So he has experience in foreign policy and refugees issues, as I've just mentioned, but goes back to the 1980s when he was in Rome and worked with the Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees there. And as Jim will also worked, as he just mentioned, a little before the show started, in Africa. He's assisted families. Peter and I worked together on getting an Afghan family here just this last year, a family of 9. And he's also working with asylum seekers and immigrants through Catholic Charities and the legal services program over there. And of course, he's a well-read person, so he knows a lot about history, and he was invaluable to have on this trip, religious history as well as political and governmental history. Jim McDermott, I've known since he came to the Congress in, I believe, 1988, if I'm not mistaken. We've been to a lot of war zones together, Kashmir, Central America, Iraq, also Middle East. So we've done a lot of traveling together, and he's had a really interesting career. He grew up in Illinois, went to school there, went to medical school there, ended up in the Navy as a medical doctor. He's a psychiatrist, and did some work with Vietnam veterans while he was in the service there. And his work in the Congress followed that with respect to the traumas that was faced by veterans, the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as you may know the acronym. And he's been a really valuable asset to have. He was on the House Ways and Means Committee, which may have been the most important and powerful committee in the House of Representatives, others in the Rules Committee. I was on the Rules Committee. And he was also very active in the legislature in Washington State as a state senator. And then, of course, now, then as a congressman followed. And now he's just finished a book. Is a book about his service in DC and his thoughts about members of Congress who have served in Washington, DC. So that's the lineup, and I'm gonna turn it over to Peter. Peter's gonna talk for maybe 10 minutes or so. Jim will talk for 10 minutes, and I'll come back on, say a few words, and then we'll get back into questions and answers and comments from you. Father Daly.
Okay. Thank you, David. And thanks to the Bradimus Center for this opportunity to share an hour with you and talk about our trip to Ukraine and to Poland. And thanks to David for making that trip possible, for getting us together and suggesting it. I probably never would have gone if he hadn't suggested it, but it was a life-changing experience, and it really opened my eyes to what's going on in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. And we'd like to share some of that with you. You know, I think this is the crisis of the major crisis, maybe, of the first part of the 21st century, and it will define things for 100 years to come, not just in Ukraine, but around the world in relationships. And what we experienced there made us realize that this is really a fight for everybody, that this is a David and Goliath confrontation, Ukraine being David and Russia being Goliath. And but it also makes us realize, like any crisis, like the pandemic, or Hurricane Katrina or some other crisis, it reveals something to us about ourselves and about our institutions. And I think it reveals both our strengths and our weaknesses. And we've found out something about our strengths and weaknesses. And one of the things that I saw in Ukraine and in Poland is that, you know, some of our institutions are good and are holding. You know, we've seen the value of NATO. We've seen the value of the European community. We've seen the value of alliances. And for me, as a priest who's often been discouraged about the condition of the Catholic Church, I saw the value of the church in its work with refugees in Poland. And that I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But we also saw the terrible wounds that this crisis is causing. And it seems like, as one Dominican sister told us in Krakow when we had dinner with her, she's a psychologist. She said the wounds of this crisis, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, won't heal for, at least she thinks, 3 generations. She said this generation and their children will still have the trauma of this experience, and it'll be the 3rd generation things will begin to heal. And she used the example of the relationship to Germany after World War II, that finally things are beginning to heal there, but it took almost 3 generations. One of the things that I was proud of to see in Poland is the way in which 1.6 million Ukrainian refugees have been absorbed into the Polish life. And we can learn a lot from the Polish government. The Polish government decided to welcome Ukrainian refugees, and that was a major change. And to give them temporary residence, give them access to all the social services, including healthcare and education. And then the Polish government couldn't do all this by themselves. They provided structure, the foundation, but they needed the help of volunteers. So there had to be head and hands involved. And that's where the church came in. And the Catholic Church is a big institution in Poland. It probably extends into every village and city in Poland, or it certainly does. They have 10,000 parishes, 42 dioceses. So they were able to welcome these 1.6 million refugees, mostly, as David said, women and children and elderly people, many, many disabled, because Ukrainian hospitals are not able to care for the disabled right now. And so the remarkable thing is there are no camps, there are no refugee camps in Poland, that all of these people were absorbed into homes, apartments, convents, monasteries, schools, retreat houses, all sorts of congregate housing, but there are no refugee camps. They have all been given a home. And I think that that's absolutely remarkable. If we were to absorb a similar number in relationship to our population as Poland, it would be like 16 million people that we would have absorbed. So you see that it's a huge impact on Poland. And I think it's very gratifying to see the generosity. One other thing that we saw was there's a cultural shift going on in Ukraine. It's true that a large percentage of Ukraine was Russian speaking and had Russian roots, partly because Stalin imported Russians there after he exterminated almost 4 million people, or about 4 million people in the Holodomor in the 1930s. So there was some sympathy for Russia, but that sympathy has gone away, or at least among the people we talked to, that has evaporated. There is now a real desire on the part of Ukrainians to separate themselves from Russia. Linguistically, they want to speak Ukrainian, not Russian. Culturally, they want to learn English, not Russian. In days gone by, under the Soviet system, everybody wanted to learn Russian so you could go to school in Russia, but now they're turning westward. We met a young deacon about to be a priest in Ivano Frankivsk, who had been educated in Ireland. And I asked him, I said, is your bishop sending people to Ireland because he wants English speakers, to his theology education? He said, yes, the bishop wants people to sort of turn westward and to be focused on, and they wanted to learn English. We spoke to 3 classes at UKU, Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. And in those classes, I asked the students 3 questions, and we got 100% positive yes answer to all 3. I said, first of all, how many of you want to be in the European Union? 100% said, yes, we want to be in the European Union. How many of you want to be in NATO? 100%, yes. How many of you want to separate yourselves from Russia? 100%. They all feel that Russia is a cultural colonial power, and that wants to dominate them, and it would crush out their life. So, and it was very interesting for me to see how that cultural shift is changing, and they're turning westward, which means they're turning to Poland and Slovakia and all the other countries to the west. And one little incident, and then I'll stop and turn this over to Jim McDermott, but we met briefly with Father Mark Makarowicz, who is the chair of the School of Religious Studies the Dean of the School of Religious Studies at Catholic University here in DC. And he told us about his family, which is Ukrainian from Western Ukraine. They had gone to dinner in Kyiv during this sort of lull in the fighting last summer. And they said, usually his family is bilingual, they speak both Ukrainian and Russian, and so they started to order dinner in Russian, which would have been the custom there, because the further east you go, more people speak Russian. And the waiter said to them, "We don't take orders in that language anymore." And I think that that's a metaphor for the whole country. They're not taking orders from the Russians anymore. They've had that for several hundred years under the czars, under the Soviet system, and now they really want to be their own nation. And one other thing, I think we might have a slide of it. David took a photo of it. When we were in Warsaw, we saw a children's drawing hanging on the wall behind the desk of a social worker there of a child looking like an angel, white. It had a blue and yellow background. And the child was holding up a sort of cross, stopping a Russian tank. And we thought that was kind of not this drawing. It's another drawing there, but anyway, it has the Ukrainian flag sort of colors in the background. No, we'll get to it. There it is. There it is. This child stopping a Russian tank, and we thought this is an example. This is how it's going to happen. So the innocence of a child is going to stop this oppression. So let me turn it over to Jim McDermott, and we'll hear what Dr. McDermott's experience is there.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Bradamus Center to do this. I have always admired John Bradamus because he came from Indiana, which was one of the toughest places in the world to represent, and he did a wonderful job. I went to Congress I changed my career. I was going to be a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist. And I went into the United States Navy in 1968 and spent 2 years dealing with casualties coming home from Vietnam. So I saw what war does to people. I saw the post-traumatic stress disorder as it was being created in that period of time. And I decided I was going to go to Congress and try and figure out how to stop war or do something about it, or do something. The feeling about this, and I think everyone watching or listening to this, you will say to yourself, well, what can I do? Well, you don't know what you can do, but you've got to get out there and do it. You got to try. And I went, I couldn't get into Congress. It took me 16 years. I finally got there in 1988, as David said. And I became a member of Congress who was involved in dealing with veterans and all sorts of things. And I became a friend with David because David and I shared this. He, having been a Vietnam veteran, he and I shared, and we got involved in going to places like Kashmir and to the Middle East and to Central America. And I think that when you go and you see what's going on in the country, you see how similar their experience of dealing with war is. And the thought that the woman has said in Warsaw, it's going to be generations, because the impact of the war on the people in that country is immense. And it's not going to go away one day when they sign a peace treaty. Someday in the near future, there'll be a peace treaty signed. But the damage from the war has been done to the souls of the people of Ukraine. Everybody in Ukraine has been impacted by this war. And we saw it in lots of different ways. In the church scene that you'll see a picture of, soldiers are walking through the church on their way. They're working in Poland, getting ready, or in Ukraine, getting ready to go to the front. And everybody who goes to the front is a man, almost. Almost, it's probably 95% male. And each day, if you can imagine this, a family, a mother and the children sit and wait for a phone call from their brother or their father or their husband, if they're still alive. Every day they do that. Imagine the tension that is for kids and people living in the safer areas in the Western Ukraine. That is a daily impact on everyone. Now, there's also, I read in the newspaper something that struck me, and as a child psychiatrist, and I'm thinking about it, nothing like this happened in Vietnam. I saw an article about young men who are having their sperm frozen so that they will leave the ability to have another generation, even if they don't come home capable of doing it or don't come home at all. People are having to think about what happens if I get killed in the front and my wife and I never had a child. So you've got things like that going on. You've also got family businesses. Men were running businesses in the family. Our driver was running a family business, and suddenly he's got to go to the front. His wife is running it, and she's running it 1-2 days at a time. She's all she can order because she doesn't know if they're going to have a business in 2 days. Imagine you're planning 2, 3, 5, 6, 10, whatever years out in the future. These people are planning 2 days in the future. It's incredible to think about what's going on as it's happening to people. And it's obviously not something that happened on TV and it would be unknown unless we went there and talked to them and heard them talk about it. And the places we went, we met people who talked about this. I also saw a story that since I got home that I think says something about what Father Daly was saying. Everybody, the students, you said to them, why don't you go to Poland and go to school instead of staying here? They said, because we want to be here with our country. They are determined to do something about their country. And now what you're seeing is people in Poland who went, 1.6 million people went out of Poland, into Poland in about a 10-day period in February of last year. And they've been over there a year trying to make it and trying to find a place to live and a job and some way. And because they don't speak Polish, they can't do it. So they're saying, let's go back to Ukraine. They're willing to go back into the country where they actually were seeing, they know on a daily basis that there's air raid sirens and whatever. The first night we were there, the air raid siren went off. And the question is, well, what do you do? You're on the 3rd floor of a hotel. Do you run down into the basement? Or do you stay in your bed? And I said, well, I don't hear any explosions. So I figured, well, I'm not going to go until I hear something more than just the air raid siren. Well, the next day we found out most people don't go by this point in the war because they've seen so much war that they've gotten kind of inured, and they try to figure out. They have this app on their computer that shows them where the air raid is coming from. Is it coming from Russia or is it coming from Crimea? And they try and make a decision about how dangerous it is. And it's a surreal quality. In the university, they don't have any choice. If the air raid siren goes off, their students have to leave the classroom and go down into the basement. And that's where we had our classes, was down in the basement in an air raid shelter. It's a world in which people are still trying to live real lives under enormous stress. And then I finally, yesterday, another article in the paper came from the New York Times. Just reading the New York Times. I live in France now, so I have the New York Times. That's all I had. And I was reading this, and there's an article in there that says, my mother carried World War II inside her like a ghost. Now, PTSD is a ghost. It's things that happen to somebody in the past, and they keep it inside them. And many of you have got friends or relatives or parents who were involved in Vietnam who've never talked about the war. They've never talked about the awful things they saw. They never talked about these sorts of things. And that's what's happening in Ukraine today. You have millions of people being exposed to a horrendous situation, and they're carrying on. It's amazing, they're carrying on. But they're carrying inside, and that's what we want you to know is what's going on inside them, what they're worrying about, what they're feeling, and understand why it's important for the United States to keep supporting them, because they are standing against the forces that don't want to have democracy, don't want people to run their own lives. So I was very pleased that David, I said to him, you know, I'm 86 years old, David. Are you sure you want an old man like me going with you? He said, if you can walk and talk and listen, come on. So I came on the trip, and it was a wonderful trip.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. And Peter, thank you as well. I'll just make a few comments as well, and then I think maybe we can go to Q&A, or if Jim and Peter want to jump in after my comments, that would be fine as well. To Peter's point, I think the justice and kindness and charitableness of the Polish people was pretty much a miracle, because you had these millions and millions of people within a short amount of time, week or so, 2 weeks, going from Ukraine to Poland. And as Father Daly said, 10,000 parishes, retreat houses, convents, monasteries. It was built to absorb those people that wanted to stay. Some of them continued to Germany, and others to Romania and Slovakia and Hungary, Moldova. But most of the people came to Poland, and millions of them stayed there. Eventually, they drifted back when they saw the opportunity to go back, but then came back to Poland again when the Russians started to bomb the infrastructure. But what the caregivers gave was quite amazing. And everything from housing to food to psychological care. All these meetings we were in Poland at Caritas, there usually were 3 or 4 psychologists there, and they talked about, you know, dealing with the children primarily, but also with adults who had deep scars as a result of what they were undergoing. So that Samaritan justice was really significant, and it is actually a model for other countries if they want to. We can learn a lot from what Poland did. A lot we can learn. I also want to say that the decolonization of Ukraine is significant, and it's strong. These students that we talk to, people on the street we talk to, people in the business community, they are strong. Well, they may have had some sentiment for Russia at some point. There's not much left because of the brutality of this war and the war crimes that were committed. Just atrocious. It's been the worst it's been since World War II in Europe. And there's been some pretty bad places in Kosovo and Srebrenica and a lot of other places. But this has been really something, the targeting of civilian housing. In Mariupol, you had a theater where 1,000 people were sheltered, children's signs outside so they wouldn't attack it, and they did. And 600 of them died. They think more, maybe even 20,000 in that city. It was a city of 500,000 people. It's down to less than 100,000 today. And then in Bucha, Jim talked about reading the New York Times. It was about a year and maybe 13 months ago. I picked up the New York Times, Jim, and I was reading the story about the massacres at Bucha. And this is a town just outside of Kyiv. And I'm flipped over the front page and I went to the jump page in the New York Times, and there's this picture of this woman who had her hand up in her face and looking awfully distraught at her relatives who had just been slaughtered in her back area of the house. And then I looked at the names just to see what the caption was, and her name was Gavriluk. Well, that's my grandfather's name, Gavriluk, and my mother's name. And I didn't know them. We probably, not that we have any relatives there, but probably somewhere there is a connection there to me. And so I felt that kind of a little stronger after I read that. And because I had been to my grandfather's village where there were Gavriluks, but that was quite a ways away from where Bucha was. So Bucha was just horrific what the Russians did there. And executions, they think close to 500 people executed and killed. Women, children, rapes, 14-year-old girls raped. It was horrific, just horrific. And you could go on from town to town, Dnipro, Mariupol, Bucha, other places where this was happening in Donetsk and the eastern part. Terrible, terrible crimes. And it follows from basically, as Peter pointed out, from centuries ago. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Potemkin, they were terrible with respect to the way they treated the Ukrainians. And then, of course, Stalin gave the orders for the Red Famine, the Holodomor. 4 million plus Ukrainians starved to death on purpose. So they don't want anything to do with Russia anymore in terms of having to bend to them. And so it's very significant what's happening. I want to say one other thing, and then I will stop. The idea behind going also was to be able to go up on Capitol Hill and make the case to keep the aid flowing so that the pipeline for Ukraine is still there. Because without the US help, they're getting significant help from the EU countries. But without US help, they're not gonna make it. And the fact that we are there helping them, and we need to continue to help them, and we need to help them in the right ways, is significant. And you can be helpful, those of you who are listening to this right now or watching it, by contacting your senators, by contacting your House members, and telling them how significant this is, because this isn't just about Ukraine. This is about the rest of the free world, and whether we want to maintain those values of freedom and justice and transparency, and all the things that the Ukrainians are fighting for. So they're fighting for not only themselves, they're fighting for us, and they're fighting for a way of life. And we're seeing a shift we have in the last, 20 years away from democracy and towards autocracy. And this is where the line has been drawn. And it's significant that we be successful. And we can be successful because we have, as a partner, of people who are smart, who are tough, who are strong, and that's what you need if you're taking on Russia, and who have been successful to this day. And, this is, Father Daly said, David and Goliath's story, but it's not just David and Goliath, it's David and the coalition. It's David and a lot of other people. That's how this is going to be successful. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we've got maybe 15 minutes left, and if there are any comments that Peter and Jim want to make on this, that's fine. And then we'll also see if we've got some comments from others who are watching. Okay, anybody else? Do we have anything, Polly, from the world out there in Etherland?
I see Father Daly has typed some responses out in the answered column under Q&A.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
I did. Somebody asked, is there any diplomatic solution? And I said, I don't see any until Russia withdraws or ceases its operation, maybe to the 2014 boundaries. And one question was about the Russians too. The Russians are also victims of Putin's policy here. I mean, as many as 100,000 Russians have died, and it's just shocking. One thing that Father Marcin said to us, he's the director of Catholic Charities in Poland, Caritas Poland. He said, you know, if Ukraine fails, we are next. Poland is next, and Poland and the Baltic countries, all of the Moldova, they feel that Putin is not going to stop at the border. He's going to try to recreate the old Soviet Union, recreate the old Russian Empire, and they strongly feel they are next. And if NATO countries are in the fight, then so are we. And so we are aware that in many ways, the Ukrainians are fighting for all of us. It's in general, one of the questions was, you know, I've been opposed to US imperialism. We've been imperialists. We've been colonialists. I mean, we had the Philippines and other places. And I've been opposed to war in general. I think Vietnam was a mistake. I think Iraq was a mistake. But there are times when you have to fight evil. And I think that this is one of those times. And so I do think that good people in good conscience can say this is a just war, but there are limits on any warfare. You know, the Ukrainians can't do anything they want either. But the war crimes that we saw, we heard about committed, and we visited with one war crimes investigation unit, Oporo, in Warsaw. And, you know, these are real. These war crimes are real. These attacks on civilians, on hospitals, on orphanages. You know, Russia has to be held accountable for what they did in Bucha, these mass graves, rape. These are, we met one we heard stories in one retreat house about rapes and things like that. It's awful. So there has to be some way to oppose this evil.
One of the questions that's on the line is, what can you do to speed up or speak to the importance of healing trauma in building the future of Ukraine? That's why I wanted to go there, was to see what they had available, how many psychologists, how many people were dealing with children. And it was hopeful to me that how many places they were using art therapy, which is a great way for kids to deal with the things that's going on inside them. They may not be able to say it, but if you put a piece of paper in front of them and hand them some crayons, they'll draw you a picture that will tell you what's bothering them. And as I looked at this, I thought how bad it was. In this war, there's no way that people can come back from the front and have any rest and recuperation. In Vietnam, if you were there for 3 months or 5 months, then you suddenly wound up getting a trip down to Australia or a trip to Thailand or somewhere, and then you went back into the field. That's not happening to these soldiers in Ukraine. They have to stay in the front, so there's no relaxation for them. I don't know how you take the pressure off them, really. I mean, that's the thing that makes me so upset, is looking at the situation where they have so few people that are trained that they can't take them out of the front line and put a new platoon in, or a new company, or a new regiment. They don't have that kind of support in the country. People are, I mean, no man, 18 to 60. Country. What is it?
18 to 60.
18 to 60. No one can leave the country if he's a male, because they are so desperate to keep people available to handle the war itself. And when you think about that, you realize that what you can do is acknowledge it and talk to people about it. But we were there such a short period of time, we can't do therapy in 3 days or 6 days. This is a long-term thing. This woman that I wrote about in the New York Times, she's carried this fight. When she came back as an driver in the Second World War, she wasn't a veteran. Nobody did anything for her. And she was 70 years old when she's telling these stories to her daughter. And that's why we have to think about that kind of stuff and make that kind of assistance part of it. It's easy to justify bullets and shells and hand grenades and that kind of stuff. But psychiatric or mental health or the kinds of things that go into healing human beings' souls is going to be as important as anything that we ever did for handing shells to shoot at the Russians.
Yeah. I'd just like to address a couple of the questions that are online, because I think that they're important, and maybe David and Jim might have some answer to them. But one, D. Kirshner asked, what will prevent this war from escalating into a nuclear war or nuclear confrontation if there's no diplomatic answer? I think victory will prevent it. You know, if the Ukrainians have in this spring offensive, and if they have substantial victory, the war can come to an end. And you know, I think in some ways we learned, you know, that the problem of appeasement in 1939, we learned that people like Putin cannot be appeased, and so there really needs to be a victory here, and that's why our aid is so important. And somebody said, Jacqueline Davis asked, what do we say to friends and acquaintances who argue that funding from the U.S. we should be addressing problems of poverty in our own country instead of the war in Ukraine? Well, I think this is everybody's fight. You know, one of the things that the United States has to stand for is democracy and the rule of law. Now, we've often been delinquent in that. We've often supported dictators and we've often supported strongmen. But here's a clear case where we really have to stand with people who desire freedom and democracy. And if, you know, the US loses its meaning if we don't do that. I think if we, you know, yes, we have a lot of needs here at home. And if we would just tax the billionaires enough, I mean, the problem is we've had these huge tax cuts under Bush and Trump that gave away our ability to meet these needs and to balance our budget. But the fact is, this is a rich country. We have the ability to walk and chew gum. We have the ability to aid the Ukrainians and address our domestic needs.
Father Daly and I are on the same wavelength in that I think there is a question of we have lost the sense of the common good in the United States. As a people, we have thought more about ourselves than about anybody else. And in the Second World War, we would never have won that war if everybody had said, well, that thing is going on over in Europe. It's none of our business. Who's this Hitler guy? Let's ignore him. But in fact, we recognized we were dealing with something that was affecting us. Even though it's at a distance, there's an ocean between us, it's still affecting us. And if we don't find the way in this time in the richest country in the world to take care of people who are willing to put their lives on the line to maintain democracy in Ukraine, we have lost the sense of common good, and no one will come to us. It's like that story that Aesop's fable about wolf, wolf, wolf. If you don't go, if you call wolf and you don't go, then what happens when nobody comes? Nobody's going to come help us. We don't be willing to help other people. That's where we are stuck right now. And that's why we went over to bear witness to what's happening. We have to keep in mind what's happening over there so that we can deal with the common good.
On the question of peace, you know, I'm reading what everyone else is reading in the newspaper and on the wires and listening to people comment on this whole war. And it seems as if people are positioning themselves to be interlocutors and people who will play a role in the peace process. And the Chinese are, Xi, their leader, is prominent in this. There is a group called BRIC. Some of you may be familiar with the acronym. That stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. BRIC. And this was put together by Lula, who was the president of Brazil, is now again the president of Brazil, years ago, to counter the power of the G7 and the Western countries and Japan. So they put this together, and they have these relationships because of it now. And you can argue on how democratic China, or not democratic, China or Brazil, Russia are, but the question is who's going to be there to be able to bring this together to the point where hostilities are stopped. I'm with Peter. I think it's very hard to negotiate. I don't want to speak for Peter. It's very hard to negotiate with someone like Putin. And, we've had a lot of experience with him now over the last decade, trying to subvert our government here in the United States, constantly trying to do that in our election process, and poisoning his own citizens and committing genocide in war areas bordering his country. He is a character that is out of the same school that some of the worst of the leaders in the world have come from. So it's going to be very difficult to negotiate with them. I mean, there are ways that this could end. This could end by the Russians getting rid of him or someone in Russia, but that's unlikely to happen. He's being more isolated because of his activities and his genocide. Lots of folks are saying that he's not going to leave, and so it's going to be very hard to capture so he can stand trial. But Milosevic in Serbia did the same thing, and he ended up dying in prison waiting for his trial. So there is some hope, and I know the Pope Francis has been interested in working, and I know one piece he's working on, piece is the children's issue, where have between 2,000 and 20,000 Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped, taken into Russia in various different ways, from orphanages, from being orphaned, from going to camps in Russia and then not returning back to their loved ones. Pope wants to change that and get them back to their families, if they have families, and to extended families if they don't have immediate families. So he's interested in a piece of this. So we will see what happens. It's difficult because of the nuclear equation piece here. It's very, very difficult. But I'm proud that we're standing firm with Ukraine, and we had a chance to do it in 2013. We didn't do it. And now we are, and I'm pleased about that. And I'm pleased that the president has been strong on that, although I wish I would provide him with some more weapons that will be more effective against the Russians. But we have been generous, and we need to continue to be so. Are there any other comments or questions that people have?
I would just like to say Michael Feldman made a comment to me personally, and I've typed my email in so you can get in touch with me. It's Seamus7474@gmail.com, and I would be glad to talk with you about what CIS is doing with mental health in the reconstruction of Ukraine. You say they're doing something on the 25th of May, and I'd like to be involved in that. I'll try if you will contact with me and we can make a plan. Thank you.
You know, one of the things that I did not say, and I'll end with this because our time is up, is bearing witness, whether it was in a bomb shelter with students or where else, is really important that they hear from us. And they were very thankful, the Ukrainians, for what the American public has done for them and their government, our government has done for them. So just being there was important. But now being there and telling these stories and sharing them with people is also very important. You can be helpful by being supportive through Razom, which is a great organization that's of Ukrainians and Americans who are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians. Their humanitarian assistance, Caritas, which has been great in terms of providing assistance for the refugees. The International Rescue Committee. There are so many Jesuit relief services, so many organizations that have been out there working very hard to provide the necessary aid for refugees, as well as getting ready for the rebuild when that comes. So, and that day will come, and hopefully we'll be there as well. So I thank my dear friends, Jim and Father Daly. Peter, thank you so much for doing this today. And I thank NYU and the Bradimus Center and Lynn and all the folks over there. We appreciate what you're all about. Thank you very much.